By this part in the series, we have gone over how to load a JavaScript file from just a basic HTML file. We've also done quite a bit on variables and flow control, making sure if conditions and a little bit of looping and that sort of thing. Today, I want to get into functions. We're starting to get pretty close to the end of what is reasonable to do for learning JavaScript just inside the browser, and I want to get to probably one of the most important pieces before we move on to some of the other stuff that you can do with JavaScript, whether it be Node.js, web development, all that sort of thing. Okay, so for a while, we have been doing exactly this right here. Basically create a string, assign it to a variable, and then we print that out with a console.log. If I refresh the page here, you see that we get exercise 4 functions, exact same message that we put directly right here. Let's kind of kick this up a notch and create a function. All right, so if you see me looking off to the side, I've got some notes that I'm keeping track of just to kind of keep things going along smoothly. All right, so let's create a function, and then I'll take some time to explain what it is. First, we're gonna write the word function. We want to do something, and then we want to open. So here already we've got a completely different type of syntax, pretty close to the loops that we've done, but we do open close parentheses and then open close brackets, and the code for our function is going to go right inside of these brackets. From here, I'm going to basically do the exact same thing that we have been doing just inside of a function. We're going to say, we're going to create a new variable message. I want to print this message, and then I want to just print it out, console.log, and we're just going to print the actual message. All right, so here's a function. Is that enough? Let's see. Refresh the page, nothing happens. Well, that's because we haven't called the function yet. So let me do that. I'm gonna say do something, and then we call it with the open close parentheses at the end of the name of our function, which is referencing the definition of our function. So we have to declare the function, put some code inside of it, and then down here call the function. And so now, once we refresh the page, now we get print this message. Okay, let's take a second to talk about what just happened. Like I said, we have to declare the function, put some code inside of it, and then run it. But what this means is that now we can break up our code into bite-sized pieces and run them or kind of keep them inside of our file without having everything always constantly run top to bottom of the file as soon as we refresh it. Now we can control which parts of our code run and in what order they run in. Something else that we can do with functions though is we can actually take data into the function, and then we can also return data back out of it. Let's take a look at what that means. So we can declare a function. I'm going to call this one make big, and I'm going to say we're going to take in a message. This is called a parameter. This is, you don't have to think about it too much. This is essentially data coming into our function. We'll talk about that in just a second. And then we can say, I want to declare another variable called var changed. And I want to basically take the message that we're pulling in and make it big. I want to make everything uppercase. So I'm going to say quite literally to uppercase. This is part of the JavaScript browser libraries. And then I am going to return that variable so that we have taken our message in, we have performed something to it, we've changed the message that was pulled in, and then we're returning that changed message back out. And so now what we're going to do is inside of a console.log, and this is really only being put here because we want to print out what has happened. We are going to say big, and I'm changing it. We're going to concatenate this with our function. So here what we're doing is I'm just kind of giving a message to kind of show what's happening. We are taking big all lowercase, and we're going to call make big, and we're going to send in the lowercase string of what happens. All right, so let me save it, and what we should get is an uppercase message. Yeah, you see here. So we sent in over here in the browser, you see that we sent in the lowercase string, and we get everything converted to uppercase. So this is, we're using parameters and we're using a return statement in our function now. So we're able to pass data into the function, make some changes on it right here at line 16, and then we're able to pass the data back out of the function with the return statement. This is where you can kind of start to see some of the mechanism and some of what's really great about functions. We can take our code, instead of it just being all over the file, we can now hold it in these little bite-sized pieces, and then we can essentially take these functions and turn them into little bitty machines, where we put something in it, we change it around, and then we send stuff back out. It's kind of cool. Okay, now to give a better idea of what you can do with some of these functions, I want to show you a few examples. I'm not going to run through all of them and explaining them, but this one right here, we can add two numbers together. We can multiply two numbers together, just like that. And then we can also start doing really fun things with our strings. We can start saying like, okay, well, a message passed in, just like we did when we capitalized the message, but now we can say, well, let me grab the amount of characters that are inside of that string. We can also do some interesting things like this right here. We can say this capitalizes only the first letter of a string and then returns that string back. And also, maybe this is a bit of a homework thing to go take a look at. Notice that we're doing all of the modifications to the data that we want to do work on, and we're doing all those modifications on this exact same line that we're having our return statement. Play around with it. If you break it, don't worry, just kind of delete what went wrong and put it back. Okay, so there's one big idea that I haven't spoken to in this video yet, and it comes up because we're talking about functions, and that idea is called scope. Scope is the idea that it's the part of the program where your variables can be accessed. Notice I didn't say where they live, where they can be accessed, because those are two very different things, but scope is very important because scope is very interesting inside of JavaScript. We won't go through the whole thing today, but I do want to introduce the concept of it to you and show you what happens whenever you start playing with it and how some of it might seem a little bit strange. Okay, so I want to use this function here, which is called for fun. We don't really do anything crazy inside of it. We declare X, we declare Y, and then we print out what the variables are. In fact, you can see that whenever we call this function, the exact same thing that has happened for everything else we've been doing. Our variables are X, Y. But what happens whenever we try to access them outside of the function? Now notice, we have only declared these variables inside the function. We're using them inside the function. We're not throwing them away, we're not killing them, we're not erasing them or anything like that. And we call our function, but then here we're trying to reuse them outside of that. Let's see what happens. Aha! So our variables are X, Y. This is right here where we've called the function. It still works just as it did before, but now down here we get a reference error. X is not defined. Now we don't get the reference error for Y is not defined because notice, we are trying to access or reference X before Y. And as soon as it hits that first error, it just breaks. It just breaks and doesn't work anymore at all. The code just completely stops inside the page. The reason we get this reference error is because JavaScript has something called function scope, where the scope is defined by the functions inside the code. So what this means, remember, I said that scope is the part of the program where your variables can be accessed. So we have a function here, and these variables, X and Y, they can only be accessed inside the function. So once we declare the function, completely fine. Once we call it, completely fine. Here we are trying to access X and Y outside of the function. No go, reference error. Very, very bad. Okay, but you might have a question at this point. Well, if we have variables inside the function and we can use them here, how come we're able to use functions or variables outside just in the file at all? Well, let's take a look at that. So going back to what we've been doing, where we have just a message, just a variable, and we print it out, no function defined whatsoever. This is called the global scope. And again, we don't have to go too far into this, but for right now, just know that we have the global scope and we have the function scope. There's a little bit more to this, but what's happening is essentially right here where we have these, or this variable and this call that is just happening. This is called the global scope, which is basically outside of every function. And then over here, we have an example of function scope, where everything is happening inside of a function. So what's happening is right up here, everything is happening in the global scope, and then right here, what's happening inside of our function is inside the function scope to that function. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover today, JavaScript functions and introducing some of the basic mechanics of scope. Feel free to go ahead, go play with this. I'll also have the code, everything that I went over, linked to my GitHub profile. If you want to see that and see the code that's there, it's been building up inside of a repo for this whole series. I'll have that linked down below. Go ahead, check that out in the description section below. If you have any questions, feel free to leave it in the comments. And if you liked the video, go ahead and give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, you can hit the dislike button too. All of that is great information. I love the feedback and the engagement. Thanks so much for watching, and as always, keep building.